Hello, can everybody hear me? Great. Adlai Stevenson once talked about the faithful remnant, so I want to greet the faithful remnant who are here for this last panel, which I think will be very interesting because we're going to talk about the future of millennial voters. I'm going to introduce people from the far right to the left, coming all the way over to me, starting with Sasha Eisenberg, who's a journalist, author of a remarkable book called The Victory Lab, The Secret Science of Winning Campaigns. He's a contributing writer to magazines that range from the New York Times to the Atlantic. He's writing a new book on marriage equality. Brian Calle is Vice President of Opinion and Commentary Coverage for the Southern California News Group and oversees 11 daily newspapers and websites. He's also editor-in-chief of CalWatchdog.com and a professor at Chapman University. Laura Davis is an assistant professor of professional practice at USC Annenberg, and that absolutely understates what she knows and the insight she has. She is also the digital news director of the Annenberg Media Center. Justin Wallin is the CEO and pollster for J. Wallin Opinion Research. He's an Unruh Institute fellow and a great supporter of the Unruh Institute. Steve McMahon is the co-founder and CEO of an enterprise called Purple Strategies. He and Alex Castellanos, the Republican, founded it together. Red, blue, thus purple. He and I first worked together 36 years ago for Senator Edward Kennedy. And he's worked for Senator Kennedy. He was Howard Dean's strategist and media person in 2004, has done a remarkable number of campaigns. My co-moderator is Chelsea Johnson, who's a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology. Her areas of focus include race, gender, and social movements. I'm going to just start right out with a question that we can come down the table if you want on it. Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, as we heard earlier today, converted a generation of young people into pretty reliable conservatives and Republicans. Millennials, in contrast, have moved toward the Democrats. Is President Trump likely to solidify or accelerate that movement?
I think there's a lot of research, obviously, that shows that the people when they're in their formative years, in their 20s, are sort of susceptible to developing political behavior and attitudes that stick with them for a while. It's right now, I think, possible to ask whether Donald Trump will be as influential a figure in the lives of people in their 20s now over a long stretch of time as Ronald Reagan was, who obviously was president for 8 years, to some degree shaped political conversation for far beyond that. I mean, it's entirely conceivable that we look back at Trump as somebody who was something of a blip on a sort of longer series of formative experiences on young people today. And I think, we should think about other institutions. One of my favorite bits of political science finding was in the sort of political socialization research paper in the early 90s. Two political scientists went and found that they looked at attitudes towards the Supreme Court among different parts of society, survey research in the late 80s. And basically what they found was that among African Americans, people who had been born between 1933 and 1953, who had experienced the Warren Court, African Americans still in 1988, people in that cohort in those 20 years had higher views of warmer views towards the federal judiciary than African Americans who had either been born before 1933 or after 1953. So even 30 years later, after the Burger Court, the beginning of the Rehnquist Court, they still had attitudes that were shaping their interest in one whole branch of our government. And views of institutions are in flux now, and we could end up in a position where, Trump sort of comes and goes, but you have young people whose attitudes towards the judiciary, towards the media, towards the military, towards the intelligence community, towards, whatever the deep state is the pejorative term, but towards the bureaucracy, are shaped by how those institutions have interacted with Trump, and that those will be attitudes that they keep with them in some form or another for decades to come. And so it's worth thinking about sort of how all those things are interacting now in the lives of how people see individuals, parties, and our governmental institutions.
I would say that I think that the importance of millennials is overstated. While they lean left, and I think are going to continue to do so as they get older, Generation Z, which is their younger brother and sisters, is actually far more conservative than the millennial generation. There's been all this data. I'm writing a book on both millennials and Gen Z, and it's phenomenal to see how on major issues there's a shift from millennials to Generation Z. So I'm not sure that, Trump is a factor one way or another for these generations. What I would say about Trump is that what's interesting about him is I don't think that he is necessarily pushing people away from the Republican Party and towards the Democratic Party. I think Trump accomplished something that, and again, a guy who doesn't support him and didn't vote for him, but just to be clear, but that Donald Trump got something done that Ross Perot wanted to do, which is I think he created a third party in this country. And when my staff and I were analyzing the results Tuesday night of the Luther Strange-Roy Moore race, the question we had in our mind before the race was decided was, is Trump more powerful or is Trumpism more powerful? And I think that's the real question. Are we pushing this next generation into a third party that could be even alternative from Trumpism or some different option for a more progressive Democratic Party? And so I don't think millennials are necessarily being pushed one way or another because of Trump. I think that because of populism, because of the dynamics in our country today, you're seeing millennials move in a variety of different generations while their younger brothers and sisters are still more conservative because they saw the travails of their older brothers and sisters.
I think your point about maybe a third party goes with my what I was going to say, which is, they might be pushing, Trump might be pushing them away a little bit from the Republican Party, and what I see in my students here, is definitely a big sense of social justice issues that I think Trump is exacerbating with some of his policies. But for me, I think one of the lessons learned from 2016 is from the Hillary campaign is you have to have more than just a anti-argument. You have to have a more offensive argument. And when you look at the field of Republican candidates from the primaries for 2016 versus the Democrats, they had all these rising stars, all these younger people that could maybe connect with the younger generation, and you don't really see that as much on the Democratic side. So I think that, maybe they're turning away from Trump to a certain extent, but what are they turning to? And I think that the Democrats need to work on that answer.
Well, I think first and foremost, the lean is the big point, because largely millennials don't identify with institutions, and there's a large distrust in institutions. That includes political parties. So whether it's marriage, political parties, whatever it might be, institutions in general are not an item of attraction in general to millennials. So Trump could well move millennials towards the Democratic Party, but only if issues are polarized to a particular sense. So you were talking about social justice issues. So certainly there are very strong feelings about things like immigration, things like gay marriage, things along those lines, which, by the way, some of those millennials have largely felt were resolved, and to some degree, depending on the issue, Trump is bringing them back to the forefront and introducing uncertainty. If those continue to move along, then he can certainly push millennials away from him into the waiting arms of the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party does not own that group of voters, and they certainly don't behave like a bloc.
There's all these microphones over here. Much of what I would have said has already been said, much more eloquently than
We'll start at your end next time.
much more eloquently than I could ever say it. But there's an interesting notion about three parties, and I think that's right. But it may be four. If you think about the Democratic Party, there's the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party, then there's the establishment wing. On the Republican side, there's an establishment wing, and there's a Trump wing. And then if you look at it on a continuum, you've got down at one end, you've got sort of economic and social progressives. And at the other end, you've got, cultural and social conservatives. And right in the middle, you have a lot of the people that voted for Obama twice and voted for Bernie Sanders and then Donald Trump. They are economic nationalists. They're people who feel like the economy is leaving them behind, and it's working for wealthy people, it's not working for them. They may be Democrats on some issues, but they're Republicans on other issues. And if there's one thing I think the Alabama race, Donald Trump every single day, and the way Democrats are kind of fighting amongst themselves, you've got a situation where those are becoming the swing voters, and they're not really attached to a political party. Whether they're millennials or not, they're attached to whatever person or party or platform is offering a solution that they think will work for them and improve their lives. And I don't know anymore that it's as neat as Democrat and Republican. I think it's a lot more jumbled.
So delving deeper into this idea that millennials are not a coherent block, if we go beyond the broad category of millennials, can we break them down into discrete subgroups likely to behave differently in the future?
And you're entitled to talk about Generation Z if you want.
Bring out the
I'm
Z.
interested in
Bring out the Z. So if we're going to start down here, of course, this is the question I'm not really prepared for. I'll just admit it. I kind of feel like I'm back in college, if you know what I mean. I think...
By the way, Steve has been to Nebraska in terms of the question asked in an earlier panel, because that's where he's from.
Yes, I've been all over the place. The subgroups are interesting. If you dig a little bit deeper, the subgroups within the millennial generation, or at least in my digging, look an awful lot like the subgroups a little bit more broadly. You've got the white millennials who actually voted for Trump over Hillary Clinton, which surprised me. African American millennials, did kind of what the African American population did more broadly. I don't know if they break as neatly along sort of socioeconomic lines as perhaps among, socioeconomic, I guess, in the sense that a lot of these issues that cut differently for a middle class, white, non-college educated, or African American or Hispanic non-college educated voter, I think, cut the same way that among the millennial group as they do among others.
Without getting into the demographic constructs that can define this, because that's what we use to target people. Huh?
It's broken? Fortunately, just as loud, right?
Is that better? All right. I think the interesting thing about the discrete groups is the change in thought over time. So take, for example, the embrace of socialism, which is not a socialism that I recognize. Socialism that I recognize from my generation looks very different from the kind of socialism that is largely attractive to millennials as a whole. It's more of a Scandinavian socialism. That Scandinavian socialism has certain aspects of it that are unique and that are friendly towards business. So they resonate well with the right side of the party as well as left parties. Lower business taxes, things along those lines. There has been research done over the last year that shows millennials, not unlike my generation, as they age and enter a certain income bracket, become annoyed by the amount of taxes that they spend and don't see a return on them. That's one of the reasons why there may be an interest viscerally in some kind of a universal healthcare system, but not a wholehearted, emphatic embrace of the Affordable Care Act. So as things change, I think we'll be able to identify groups that are defined by demographic indicators, but there's a movement within the millennial construct as their thoughts change. And a lot of it's very similar to everyone else, by the way. It's just kind of how people do tend to think. The Gen Xers thought that way, the baby boomers thought that way. There's a certain degree of social liberalism, and that impacted government spending, but as time moved on and they became personally impacted by the ramifications of that spending, the approach became nuanced a bit. They weren't totally emphatic about supporting those various government programs.
I guess I'll go ahead and bust out my millennial status here and just say, so I'm a millennial and I also teach I'm like one of the oldest millennials and I teach the youngest millennials. So just to, answer your question on its face, yeah, there are differences between us. I was just saying before this panel, my students are surprised to find out I'm a millennial. And I do see distinct differences in the way that, I teach digital journalism, so I see distinct differences in the way that we interact with technology and how that's sort of defined and shaped us, even though we're the same generation technically. From an election perspective, I grew up in the Midwest. I grew up in Missouri, and when I think about this question, I think are they different? I think absolutely. I think that people my age or younger, who are in Missouri, they're not necessarily the same voting bloc as me. I think of myself much more defined geographically than generationally, with the people I went to high school with or whatever. And I remember, I was working election night in the student newsroom here, and after the election was over, I just thought to myself, oh my God, there are two Americas. And that to me was defined more by geography and culture than by generation.
I'll dissect it a couple of different ways. So I think one interesting point to piggyback on what you were saying is that millennials assumed technology and the technological revolution at puberty, right? So there was a lot going on, a lot of changes happening biologically, and then all of a sudden technology comes in and completely disrupts their life. So I'm a millennial as well. I'm the oldest possible millennial, and I'm going to cling to that until the day I die. And for me, I got this type of technology when I was 13, 14, right? Younger family members, they grew up on this, and Generation Z is really the first generation that are complete digital natives. But what that does psychologically is it programs us a different way. Rather than our grandparents or our parents, who if they wanted to know the answer to a question, they had to go to an encyclopedia or look to authority to ask what the answer was. We never had to do that. And this Generation Z doesn't have to do that either. They can say, is the earth flat? And they get, satellite imagery and a bunch of other information that tells them what the answer is. So
Unless they get fake news.
Unless they get fake news. But I work for 11 newspapers that are not fake news. The LA Times, on the other hand, no, just kidding. So for us, I think for millennials and Generation Z, that shapes the worldview. And so when you start to look at where they fall in terms of political ideology and on specific subsets of issues, you see data playing in, right? So education is really important. So education reform becomes an important issue because they see the numbers. Science becomes really important. So there's support for climate change and environmental policy. Social justice issues, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's where this kind of mindset for millennials comes in, where they have specific categories of issues that are really important, but it's data-driven, it's solution-driven.
I'd point to the distinction between college on the younger end of millennials, college-going millennials, and non-college-going millennials. We talk a lot about that distinction in polling in terms of graduates, as you get older, for older generations, because there have been pronounced gaps in support for candidates in the last couple of elections, very explicit in this election. You heard a lot of talk this past year about different attitudes between college-educated whites and non-college-educated whites. But I've written a lot about tactics recently. I'll just sort of talk from a sort of tactic operational perspective in campaigns. It's a lot easier to target people when they are in college than it is to target their same cohort not in college. Colleges are, if nothing else, a wonderful centralizing, I always forget the difference between centripetal and centrifugal, but the one that brings people into the same place makes it a lot easier for campaigns to find, register, persuade as necessary, and then turn out voters. And so that's why disproportionately, I think when we talk about colleges, when we talk about campaigns trying to communicate with young voters, you see stuff happen on college campuses because it is effectively one-stop shopping for your targets. If you're going out and trying to talk to 19, 20, 21-year-olds who are not enrolled in college, which is still a significant percentage of the population, they're diffuse the way that the rest of the population is diffuse. And if they don't have a history of political participation, they're not registered, they haven't given money, they're they're basically not knowable, and it's really hard to know enough about who they are to want to actually go out and register and persuade and mobilize them. And so it becomes a lot easier for campaigns to think about talking to the younger end of millennials by visualizing those who are in college than those who are not in college. This starts to flip once they graduate, because college graduates have a lot more mobility, social, economic, and geographic. And so they become a real problem for campaigns because they start moving around. They have to be re-registered where they move. People, for campaigns to track them, sort of track data, keep current cell phone, email addresses for them becomes a real challenge. And so at that point, as these millennials get beyond their college years, college-educated ones become sort of vexing for campaigns to track down and continue communicating with.
Brian, you wanted to say something else, and by the way, we're moderators. We're not really in charge. If you guys say something and somebody else wants to respond, just jump in.
Great, yeah. Well, one thing I think we all agreed on was it's hard to categorize millennials on any of these issues, but one issue where there's almost uniform agreement, interestingly enough, is the student loan crisis. And so I just got data today, which I wanted to share, and I forgot when I was talking, but there was a poll, data came out today, 50% of millennials said they would give up their right to vote in the next 2 presidential cycles to have their loans forgiven. Isn't that crazy? 50% said they would give up
Trump might take them up on that.
I know, yeah, right? And just because these are funny, 44% said they'd give up ever using Uber or Lyft again if they got their loans forgiven. 42% said they would never travel outside the United States for 5 years if they could get their student debt forgiven. 27% said they'd be willing to move in with their parents for 5 years if they could get their student debt forgiven. 13% said they'd be willing to give up texting, so they like texting, because not many want to give that up. And only 8% said they'd rather keep paying their loans than do any of the above.
Can I just say, was the highest one giving up voting?
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. And I think it gets to what I think was a theme, I think everyone but me mentioned it in the first answer, which was like the lack of trust in institutions, right? And that's, I think, something that just from a news perspective we're really dealing with too, is, trust in institutions is down and trust in news is way down. And that makes it really hard for elections as well, because when you're trying to get news out there on candidates and stuff, it's hard when you feel like no one's going to believe what you're writing. So that sucks.
But if I could give up my car note, my mortgage, and my student loans from USC, I would totally not vote for 2 election cycles.
So this strikes me a little bit differently, which is it seems like they're animated by the very same things that somebody who's a blue collar worker in Wisconsin or Michigan. It's economic issues. Student loans, most of these people that are walking around with student loans are walking around with student loans that are pretty significant. And it's, again, it's kind of like they're looking at an economy and a political system that is working really well on the coasts and isn't really working very well for the people in the middle. And they're trying to figure out how they're going to pay their student loans. So I actually don't think that they're probably as willing to give up their right to vote as this question would suggest. But they're desperately trying to figure out how they're going to make it in today's economy, even though they have an education and they have a college degree, presumably, because they have this debt that they're carrying around on their back, which is why, I think that if you look at Trump and Bernie Sanders and the things that their 2 campaigns had in common, both parties really need to wake up because both parties missed it. Hillary Clinton missed it and almost, missed getting nominated as a result of it. And then she missed it again in the general election because she didn't give anybody the economic argument. Now, I don't think Trump gave a particularly compelling one. And by the way, just to be clear, I hate Donald Trump. But at least he was saying, make America great again, and I'm going to cut your taxes. I'm going to give you more money in your pocket, and I'm going to let your family, prosper again. And Democrats just basically said, he sucks.
So I want to... We saw some remarkable numbers this morning about millennial attitudes on a whole variety of issues that even among millennials who identified with Republicans, they were more liberal by a significant margin than other Republicans. Given their liberal views on social issues, are a majority of them simply out of reach for the Republican Party? I know we talked about 4 parties, but there are some big impediments to actually having more than 2 parties in this country. Is it going to be really tough for Republicans, especially conservative Republicans, to reach a majority of these folks and enlist them? Sasha, you want to start?
I mean, so there are a few possibilities here, right? One is some of these issues disappear. You know, gay marriage is an example of something that was a very live issue in American politics for the better part of a decade, dominated, you could argue, in cultural terms, American politics for a decade. Now, as a legal matter and political, is gone. I don't think there's going to be another candidate who runs for office anywhere in America who's going to ask for their opinion on gay marriage. Yes, Roy Moore, possible exception. But we, you know, that's been replaced by a new set of issues. I presume that, you know, conversations over legalizing drugs are going to, you know, I think we're in the midst of marijuana being elevated into something of that level of attention. I don't see why that doesn't continue with the debate over decriminalizing or legalizing hard drugs. Are the coalitions going to break down differently among people in communities who are affected differently by sale, distribution, abuse, addiction of drugs? Possibly. That's a place where you could see a sort of cleavage generationally. And I think that, you know, we'll be dealing with, you know, abortion is an issue where we haven't seen a great generational change. And there are indicators scattered, I think, that some parts of younger generations are more restrictionist on abortion. You know, I think some of these issues, there are people in the Republican Party who say that they should neutralize them or you know, either by moving left or stopping to talk about them, but it's very difficult given the nature of coalitions and primary politics for anybody to win in the short term by laying down arms on these things. So I suspect that you know, that some of these issues will be with us for a while, and that there will be you know, some places where it's good politics for Republicans to push the right side of a culture battle, and there are places where the coalitions will shift. I mean, I think the thing that will be with us for a while is the debate over transgender rights, and what I assume is the sort of next step of that, which is what do you do with various single gender institutions, many of which were created during a period of women's rights out of feminist interests to protect the interests of girls and women. And there you'll have conflicting liberalisms, and I'm not sure if it's entirely clear what the consensus position on the left will be if transgender rights and, you know, single sex, you know, Title IX definition of gender parity comes into conflict with one another.
Yeah, let me try to push that a little harder, because you said something that I thought was very interesting, and I'll make a historical reference here. You said, well, the issue of marriage equality is settled. Abortion basically has been there since 1973. Attitudes haven't changed much. In 1982, when he had his first Supreme Court vacancy, Ronald Reagan appointed Sandra Day O'Connor. We now know that he never asked her about the issue of choice or abortion, and presumably, because there's nothing in the record indicating it, Ed Meese and the people who were working for him and influential in that selection also never asked that question. There are some people who believe that he understood that she would probably vote to uphold Roe v. Wade and appointed her precisely because he did not want a Supreme Court before the 1984 election that rolled back Roe v. Wade. President Trump seems determined to keep the promise he made during the campaign and to select Supreme Court justices from this approved list on the far right. What happens if he gets a second appointment, he appoints another Gorsuch, and suddenly the court starts overturning some of these issues that engaged and moved millennials and that they cared about a lot? Anybody, you can weigh in on that.
My hunch on this is, as Bob mentioned, writing a book about the sort of history of the battles over gay marriage, so I talk to people more about the past of this than the future. It's hard to imagine, I think, a case coming up that would call into question the Obergefell mandate. It is, as we are starting to see with this Colorado cake shop case that's up this year, to see a lot of cases that can start to constrain how that is interpreted, and religious liberty, religious freedom is obviously one place where it is bounded. And
what if it happens? What if you get, because that was a 5-4 decision, and you are one vote away from overturning Roe as well, which I think would spark a huge reaction in the country. What happens then with these younger and more liberal voters? And they're more liberal, not necessarily on economic issues, I agree with that, but on these social issues.
So I think that that's when you see an opportunity for activism, right? So I think that if hypothetically something like that would happen, and I always say that the thing that scares me most is when Kennedy gets off the bench, because I think he's the best justice there because he's moderate like me. So I think for me, what happens is you see activism from millennials. I think that's when you see a demand from millennial voters that Congress acts to protect gay marriage because they can pass laws, and Congress acts to protect the rights of women. And that's when you see, I think, a demand and a shift in the electorate. And so if, hypothetically, that were to happen under the Trump administration and you had a court shift that seismically, I think then you have a demand by millennials on both sides of the aisle that say, no, these things aren't acceptable, we need elected officials who are going to fix it. And you see a renewed activism, an activist spirit from that group. And I most certainly see that happen. I mean, I personally would be up in arms. I mean, as a gay male, like the thought of us going backwards on gay marriage is absurd to me. And the U.S. is led so that other countries could lead in this way. So I think this generation most certainly would step up and say this is absolutely not acceptable. And even as I mentioned earlier, Generation Z, while more conservative than their brothers and sisters who are older, are still on civil liberties issues, social justice issues, still in the same wheelhouse. And so most certainly I think that you'd see a renewed activism and you'd see a change in the most certainly in what is expected of Congress.
Theoretically, if we want to game this out, right? In both those cases, if Obergefell or Roe got overturned, both of these matters would go back to the states. One of the things we've seen in the last few years when we've had state-level debates over these sort of social issues, sexual politics issues, is that the business community, which doesn't necessarily have an ideological stake in gay rights or in the bounds of reproductive freedom, do see that in the competition for skilled workers, they want to be in places that have liberal social policies. And so,
South Carolina, Texas.
Well, North Carolina and
South Carolina. That's where the manufacturing is.
I bet that the day that there is a new effort to advance a proactive bill to curtail gay or lesbian rights, that Boeing and the South Carolina Chamber will end up where the North Carolina banks were.
This just happened in Texas.
This happened in Texas, happened in North Carolina.
There was a transgender bill. It was moving through the legislature. The business community got very, very active, and the Speaker of the House, Republican Speaker of the House, just killed the bill.
It happened in Arkansas when there was a bill that Walmart and Tyson Foods, neither of which are, we think of as going to be the first ones to the barricades, were lobbying the legislature and the governor. So I do think that if you did have the removal of a federal mandate on abortion rights or on marriage equality, pretty quickly you'd have 44 states that ended up on the left side of that through legislative or executive action. And there'd be a lot of pressure in the other 6 states, which basically are the states that voted for Wallace and Thurmond, that they'd have these sort of wrenching internal debates where the business community was on the opposite side of the religious right, and the business community ends up being a proxy for the young people that they want to hire in the future.
Steve and Justin, I want to just pull you in and say, wouldn't it make more sense for Trump, given the demographics of the electorate and given the fact that he drew to an inside straight? I mean, he had a very narrow path. He actually traveled that path, and you change 38,000 votes in 3 states, and he's not president. Wouldn't it be prudent for him to try to find a way to do the kind of things that Reagan did in the 80s? And why won't he?
Do you remember the 80s? Go ahead. Yes. Because I'm much too young to remember the 80s.
Yeah. All right, as the resident old fart, I'll speak to it. I kind of think to some degree he is, right? I mean, he's always surprising, whether there's some consistency there. I mean, he has reached across the aisle. He has recognized that he's a legislative conundrum in terms of aligning solely with Republicans and the totally horrifying Freedom Caucus and all the ineffectiveness that goes along with that. I think he's moving towards that to affect some degree of his...
But not on climate and social issues.
Well, no, it's not going to happen, but I think, barring, leaving the... its name has escaped me, but leaving the, anyone?
Paris.
Thank you, Paris Climate Accord. Barring that, what else is he really going to do? I mean, I think that was a symbolic gesture largely, and I think that businesses have already, and states have already suggested they will continue to align with that. In fact, to pivot from that creates certain issues in terms of business, especially manufacturing businesses, that they may not be willing to reinvest to do a pivot. So I don't know as he needs to do anything more or feels inspired to do anything more, but with the caveat that I certainly don't have an insight to the man's brain.
Well, does he have a brain? That's the first question. It's a terrible thing to waste, but he seems to be wasting it. I actually think that if he followed the model of Clinton and to some degree Reagan and triangulated a little bit more, he did that one thing with Chuck and Nancy, as he called them, and it was and actually it was probably responsible for a 3 or 4 point increase in his approval rating because he did that thing with Chuck and Nancy. And I think what you've had in the last 6 months in particular is a lot of the right-wing ideologues who were constantly trying to appeal only to that 33% base of Trumps have left the White House. They're still out there. Steve Bannon is still very loud and proud, but he's now being surrounded by a group of people that most believe are a little more moderate than the group that left. And if that's the case and they have the kind of influence that one would hope that they would have, he would start to reach across the aisle and do some things that are a little bit more bipartisan. His partisan approach hasn't worked on anything. It's going to be interesting to see what happens on tax reform because it's a $5.8 trillion tax cut that's not paid for right now, and it all looks really good to all the Republicans who are talking about it currently. But as the pay-fors start to come home to roost and people start to complain about all their tax breaks that are being taken away to pay for it, and the Freedom Caucus and some of the others who are pledged to try to control spending and the debt begin to get pushback from their constituents, I think this last stand of let's do it all and only with the Republicans is going to kind of run its course, and he's going to be left at the end of the year with no significant accomplishments and with nothing on the horizon that he can do without Democratic support. I think it might drive him a little closer to Chuck and Nancy and a little further from the Freedom Caucus, which would be, if you got to deal with a Republican president, you at least hope you can deal with him in the middle of the field and not just on the far, far right.
I want to say that while I didn't vote for him and I didn't vote for Hillary Clinton either, I don't support much of what Trump has done thus far. I don't think that he's stupid. I think that he's calculated. I think that much of his manipulation of public opinion and media, my industry, is borderline brilliant. I think that every time there's a legislative defeat for him, and there have been several this year, particularly around Obamacare, he dangles some big, juicy carrot out in front of the media. So the narrative on healthcare reform failing for the third time isn't what anyone's talking about. It wasn't even this first time. They talked about the transgender tweet that he sent out. So page 1, Donald Trump goes after transgender in the military. Page 6, Republicans are inept at doing what they promised voters for 6 years, pass healthcare, repeal of Obamacare. Same thing happens this week. And what do you get? NFL. That's the big story. So I think he's masterful at manipulating public opinion and communications, and I think he's doing a very good job. I also think that his meetings with Chuck and Nancy have also been to send a signal to Republicans that says, hey, listen, my Trumpistas, my base, they're not going to abandon me. They're going to abandon you in the midterm election if you don't start coming along with me. And I think he's doing this very interesting dance where he's starting to signal that to them. And I don't know what comes of it from a policy perspective because I'm absolutely scared shitless every time I see Chuck, Nancy, and Donald Trump in a room together. But I'm equally scared when I see, him with any of the Republican leadership.
Well, it may be clever in the news cycle, but if you're focused on millennials, the very things you cite, like the fight over the NFL players, transgender bathrooms, the travel ban, his reaction to Charlottesville, all of those things, I think not only limit him in terms of his approval rating growing and his likely reelection, but they really limit him with millennials and even with your Generation Z fans.
But the millennials didn't get him elected, and he knows that. I think it strengthens him with his base, which is all he's trying to do.
He can't, well, I would just suggest he can't get reelected with 35% of the vote.
Yeah, actually, millennials did elect him, and so did blacks and Latinos and women. I mean, the proportions of those groups that voted for Trump were no different than Romney. I mean, that's the fact. I mean, angry white males did not elect Donald Trump. That did not happen. It was a different dynamic. People who are unhappy with institutions elected Donald Trump by a razor-thin margin. And it's arguable that they would have been happy with Bernie Sanders if he wasn't so large government, because as it turns out, government is an institution. So there's some cognitive dissonance there. But the anger there and the economic malaise was very real. And he captured that. And the challenge for Republicans is there's a disconnect. Well, it's also a good thing for Republicans, especially in California. That there's a disconnect. There's no long tail with Donald Trump. Unless you stand up and wave your hand and say, I'm with that man, he's perceived as independent of you and independent of the Republican Party because of his actions. Crazy, not crazy, whatever it is, that's the perception. And I think that if Republicans can move towards actually getting something done, it has to be one of those two key things, right? There's only two things that matter in terms of what they do. One is tax reform, or whatever you want to call it, and the second is healthcare. They got to do one of those things. If they don't do one of those things, they own it. And they become the do-nothing Congress, which is an institutional organization that cannot affect change, that does not change people's lives. That's the third rail for voters, I think. And Trump, I think, influences that. But you had a question earlier about, is he going to do something that's going to energize? You use the terms activism. That's the big question for me. And when I model out next year, I don't think so right now. I mean, short of something that you spoke about, a Supreme Court overturning of something that's massive like that, I don't see it happening. I do see turnout larger than I would normally see on a midterm because these issues are going on and it's still creating emotions. But I don't necessarily see a spike in millennial activity and activism, barring something along those lines.
Well, the only scary thing, and I hate to say this, and I'm going to cross my finger and knock on wood, is that if we do have military conflict with North Korea, I think there's your issue.
Yeah, we have military conflict with North Korea. We got a whole basket of problems. But that is an issue, by the way. And you know what's interesting about that?
That's why I'm buying property in Nevada now, because it could be oceanfront soon.
Okay, but there's an interesting nuance on that in terms of issues that were meaningful and perhaps Republicans take for granted. So Republicans view voters as blocks. They're guilty of it just as Democrats are. And veteran populations are the block that Republicans most want to take ownership of. There's an analysis done the last couple of months of how people voted in high veteran concentrations. And this was on the East Coast and towards the Midwest. Oh, sorry. It turns out that those populations that had high veteran populations voted disproportionately for Trump. And while an economic component was there, it appears that one of the big components was that he was very vocal about being less interventionist in foreign wars. North Korea could really be a hiccup for him. That could be an Achilles heel. So if he actually goes down a path of continuing to inflate that and we end up in a situation that we can't back away from and there are actually people getting killed, that may end up being the biggest issue that faces his presidency next year, or 2 years.
So I have a slightly different view in terms of next year's midterms. I know we're here to talk about millennials, and millennials can make a difference in a lot of these elections if they start to show up. Only about fewer than 50% of millennials actually voted in the presidential election. But the circular firing squad that Donald Trump is inflicting upon his party by going after these issues that millennials and Gen Xers and Gen Zers in particular find, frankly, abhorrent, and that are completely settled among those generations, create symbolic problems for his party at a national level. They create problems for mainstream Republican candidates who either have to embrace his craziness or they have to reject it and deal with the Trumpistas. And if you look at where the generic vote is today for 2018 and the approval rating of Republican leadership in Congress, I haven't seen numbers this bad ever before. And so if Donald Trump or anybody at the RNC thinks that the Trumpistas are going to come out and save the Republican majority based on what the Republican majority has delivered so far since they took control of all three branches of government. I think they've got another thing coming, and you've seen this before, and it doesn't usually end well for the party that's sitting in the White House. All the conditions are there. You know, maybe they can get a tax cut bill through that makes people happy, but it seems to me that they're on a path to do exactly what they've kept doing, which is to make the 33 or 35% of the base very happy, to alienate many mainstream Republicans, to alienate independent voters who actually determine the outcomes of a lot of these elections, and to drive enthusiasm not among their base but among our base, the Democrats. So I just keep hoping that they keep doing what they're doing, because I think it's going great so far.
I mean, all the conditions are there except for unemployment is remarkably low. The great irony, of course, is that you have a president who talks down the economy. If the only thing you saw in the newspaper is what the president says about the state of the economy, you'd think things are a lot worse than the actual economic reality writ large. And so I think you're in an unusual situation where, you know, questions about how people perceive their own economic conditions and the trajectory of the national economy next year will be really interesting, because I don't think Trump knows how to, you know, he takes these very sort of microcosmic victory laps, like I saved X hundred jobs at Carrier in Indianapolis, but his only condition is some version of the American carnage describing some sector of the economy. And so how does he talk about the economy next year if it is doing well in a way that Republicans get credit for that?
I actually think, and I'm sorry to bogart the microphone here, and those of you who are my age might remember what that refers to, but if you think about the top line statistics that you just referenced, you're absolutely right. The economy is doing well. This is actually the same problem that Barack Obama had in 2012, because the top line indicators suggested the economy was doing well. Unemployment was going down, the stock market was going up, you know, the economy was getting stronger and better, jobs were being created at fairly hefty levels every month. And yet in the middle of America, they're going, you know what, it might be low unemployment, but what I'm dealing with is low wages. And I can't get a job that pays what my old job paid before I got laid off and the union took the plant to another state or another country. I'm sitting here making $7 or $8 or $10 an hour, and my life isn't getting any better. So it almost seemed like every time Democrats at that time would brag about how great the economy was doing, they were almost insulting the people for whom the economy wasn't doing very well at all. And I think Donald Trump is about to endure that very same phenomenon, because the economy, by the numbers, is doing great. Unemployment is down, the stock market is up, jobs are being created every month, and yet there's this condition in much of the country outside the coasts where people feel like their lives are getting worse and not better, and nobody's helping. And frankly, it's you know, I just feel like the Democratic Party, the party that I love, needs to think more about how you talk to people about their economic circumstance and how we're going to improve it, and less about, you know, bathrooms and the social issues that, frankly, in the middle of the country, people are, they feel like everybody's rights should be protected, but they feel like their lives are hanging in the balance and nobody's talking about them.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on something that really rang true to me with the 2016 election. I don't know if it's a Republican Party thing or if it's a Trump-specific phenomenon, but, you know, when we're talking about social issues, to me, it's like Access Hollywood tape. You know, like women's rights and the way you treat women, that's a social issue. And really, honestly, when that tape came out, I was like, this is it. It's over, it's done, you know? And it wasn't done. And I think your point is, you know, the economy was what was more important to people, and whether people dismiss Trump's behavior because Trump is Trump and whether that would fly for another Republican candidate, I don't think we know. But for me, it feels like there's a lot of talk and a lot of activism around these social issues, but is that translating into votes? And that at this point, it's too hard to make these arguments when so many people are suffering economically.
Yeah, I would just observe, to quote Barack Obama, that, to paraphrase him actually, that a party has to do more, be able to do more than one thing at a time. And I think the mistake of 2016 was not that Hillary Clinton or Democrats stood up for social justice on these issues. They forgot about economic justice. They didn't communicate on it. And I think you have to do both. And I think the Access Hollywood tape became the bright, shiny ball that distracted them from having an economic message in the last stage of the campaign. Now, we're going to still stay on millennials, and Chelsea wants to ask, I think, about how they communicate.
Yeah, so we've talked about millennials' distrust in institutions. We've talked about low voter turnout. We've also talked about not valuing the vote. Do millennials, even when they don't vote, see themselves as politically active, and how does that express itself?
I don't know if I would say politically active, but most certainly politically aware. So politics has become a form of entertainment. And I think, I always refer to the Trump presidency as the highest rated and most recent season of The Apprentice, because so many people are tuning in because this person is president. I mean, when you have presidential debates that are destroying NFL games in prime time in terms of ratings, I mean, that's something to be said. So millennials are most certainly aware, and sometimes I think we think that our vote or our activism is a tweet or a comment or a contribution to a charity online, and sometimes disassociate the actual act of voting. And so it's interesting because some of the research that I'm doing on this is fascinating, because while they like politics as entertainment and watch political shows, whether it be House of Cards, and were interested in debates and had drinking games associated with the debates and all these kinds of things, they also, because of that distrust in institutions we've talked about, they're like, does it really matter who's going to get elected, because they're going to accomplish nothing that's good anyway? So it's really just something that we have to deal with and watch and tolerate, not something that's going to be consequential directly to my life.
Well, I think that, millennials are very engaged on social media, obviously. And that's, I think that it's created a general sense of empowerment for them, more so maybe than previous generations. But is that actually translating to anything? I'm not really sure. Like, I think, Brian was saying they're more aware, and they're definitely more vocal, at least in writing about it. I feel like there's a certain, at least on my Facebook feed, there's a certain amount of just this overwhelming for me, but groundswell if you don't say something on this issue, or something's going on in a social issue and you don't speak out against it, or you don't say something, it's almost like you are complicit, or it's just I feel this overwhelming sense on my Facebook feed that everybody has to have their piece heard about it. And I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, because I'm not sure if that is, I'm not sure if they're applying much nuance to thinking about these issues, and two, if they're sort of feeling this false sense of I'm doing my part and I'm making a difference, when I'm not sure how much difference that's making.
I think she wants to follow that up with you for a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Continuing on with social media, given that millennials obtain most of their news online, how susceptible are they to fake news? And does their greater digital literacy lessen that impact?
Well, I think that when you're talking about fake news, I think that overall, digital literacy is the most important, news literacy and digital literacy is the most important thing overall across generations. Since you gave us the questions ahead of time, I was looking up some stats on this, and BuzzFeed's Craig Silverman.
Questions ahead of time? Yeah, why didn't we?
Because so I'm following the fake news issue, right? And
Hell, I didn't get the questions ahead of time.
So I looked up to see, I've been reading about, hyperpartisan news on Facebook, and that sometimes translates into fake news. You see from Craig Silverman's research at BuzzFeed that actually the most shared, hyperpartisan or fake news articles were conservative leading up to the election. So if we're talking about, millennials being more liberal, it doesn't seem like they're being taken in by fake news on Facebook, at least, as some of their maybe more conservative counterparts are. And to be honest with you, I've heard arguments on both sides. I've heard young people say to me, what the problem is with fake news? It's older people who don't understand how to use Facebook. And then I've heard, other people say to me, me, oh, younger people, they're not educated about news sources, and they don't know what's right from wrong on Facebook. So I have to say I don't know what the breakdown is on how they're being affected with fake news, because I do think it crosses generations, and all I can say right now is that it's spreading faster in conservative circles on Facebook.
Go ahead, guys.
And I would say that it's actually affecting both liberal and conservative readership online, in particular, in terms of fake news. And a great example of this is my sister, who's not political in the slightest. To the left of me, probably on most issues. And she texted me, I think yesterday or the day before, and she said, "Brian, is it true that we declared war on North Korea?" Literally, I mean, this was very serious. She was concerned. She lives in California, right? So she's like, and I was like, no, not exactly. The president sent out one of his tweet rampages, and the minister of North Korea used it as a political tool to say, this is a declaration of war. We have not officially declared war. We are not. And then she started citing all these kind of fake news sources on the left and the right. And I was like, and so I had to go through and dispel them. And this is a girl who is a year and a half younger than me. So she's 34 years old. She is very smart, and she had no idea what the actual story was. Part and parcel because the sources online that say different things. Also because a lot of newspaper organizations, not mine, rely on clickbait. Even for really good newspaper institutions are starting to put headlines that are controversial and aren't necessarily fully true to get people to click on them. And so it's a huge problem, which I think furthers the distrust in institutions. So now, and this is actually really bad for democracy, so you have distrust in government, and then you have distrust in the fourth estate, which is media and journalism, which is supposed to hold government accountable. And so there has to be some reckoning, and that's what I think about and what scares me the most, because I don't know where that comes from.
And Trump is really exploiting that, calling things he doesn't like fake news, right? And then it makes it easy for him to dismiss, when CNN or the New York Times have, something that's, not so flattering on him. It makes it even easier for him to dismiss it, and he's really he's piggybacking off of this real phenomenon, but he's exacerbating it.
I think we have two final questions before we turn this over to the audience, and I guess Steve will kill me if I don't start at this end with him.
No, I won't.
Okay, I'll start with Sasha. Millennials as a group may be more inclined to vote Democratic, but they've also been inclined not to show up for midterm elections. They show up in lower numbers than other groups for presidential elections, but they show up in even lower numbers in midterms. Is that going to be different in 2018, and we can just come straight down the table?
So this is, historically, old people have voted at higher rates than the young people. What's new is that we have a kind of sorting of the parties generationally in a more pronounced way than we did 30 years ago. And that's happening on sort of both ends, right? New Deal era, the New Deal generation Democrats have largely died off. Older voters are far more conservative now than the same demographic group was in the 80s and 90s. And they vote at the highest rates behaviorally, and now you have younger voters who current opinion suggests have a significant, if not a partisan skew in partisan loyalties, definitely a skew in likely voting habits coming up. That is a permanent problem for Democrats, and one reason I think that midterms have gotten bad for them, regardless of whether they're in or out of power. We know how to mobilize people who are not frequent, reliable voters. There's a huge body of research, a lot of empirical literature on what it takes to mobilize a non-voter. We know basically, the optimal thing to say when you knock on their door. We know the optimal thing to say on a phone script. We know how many pieces of mail you should send them to maximize your return. It's not really a mystery how to do this efficiently. We also know how expensive and tough it is, and thus how difficult it is to do at scale. I think that Democrats have a lot of targets among their young voters, given the seeming disparity in support for the parties at the moment. The problem is that the capacity that you need to actually mobilize those people in large enough numbers to dramatically change an electorate takes a lot of money or a lot of volunteers. And the places where Democrats are going to have certainly their most contested Senate races next year, a lot of those, places like North Dakota, places like West Virginia, are not places where you have particularly large young liberal populations, where you have sort of Democratic or left-leaning volunteer cultures. And so, the question is going to be, can you develop the capacity in places like those to mobilize the voters that you have out there?
I just want to come down quickly. California has 7 Republican congressional seats that could be a jeopardy. So if you can mobilize those people here, so the question is, do you think it will happen, Brian?
No, absolutely not. So I live in Orange County, where there's 4 of those targeted races. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton are on the ballot, and the 4 Republicans still win, despite Hillary Clinton winning the presidential vote in each one of those districts. So in an off-year election, where Republicans have a higher turnout and Democrats don't have a Barack Obama, a Hillary Clinton, or a Donald Trump on the ballot, there's no way. And another data point that I would point to as well is that in each of these runoff elections that we've seen since President Trump has been elected, where Democrats promised that the millennials were going to come out, and even had a millennial running in Georgia for that congressional seat, and he was all the rage all over the country, still could not drive out turnout to defeat incumbent Republicans. So I don't think it's going to happen. It was better, but again, it can be better, but I don't think it's going to be
So
the
all
tsunami.
of you agree with this, that we're not going to see a higher millennial turnout? And
I mean, at the margins. I mean, and we're talking about all this stuff at the margins. And I would note that, like, last year, as best we can tell, turnout among African American millennials went down for the first time in several cycles, but went up for young Latinos, young whites, and young Asians. And so I think that we might start looking at the Obama years as an anomaly, not necessarily the Trump years as the anomaly.
just want to give everybody else a chance to weigh in on this quickly.
Yeah, so I'm going to go with no.
Okay, that was quick.
Yeah, exactly. For all the reasons that Brian stated, and you just have to look at history. It's the best indicator of future behavior. And sorry,
If you look at history, Donald Trump's not president.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the polling was close, right? I mean, that was the answer to all those polls. It was close. You couldn't really kind of determine what was going to happen. But millennials don't vote in a meaningful fashion to have consequence over the elections. They certainly don't in off years. And in terms of Orange County, just a little microcosm, completely agree with that, although ISA is in real trouble. But the greatest gift to the Republican Party is Democratic candidates have absolutely no optics whatsoever and are leading with Russia, which people could give a spit about. I mean, absolutely not on the radar. No one cares about Russia. And yet it's very, very hot with the Democratic candidates. So.
Steve?
It's sad but true. They're not going to show up.
Okay. I would bet on this, except the last time I bet Brian in public and I lost. He said he wasn't for Trump, but he was going to win. I said, no, he's not going to win. And so he challenged me to a bet.
You said you're crazy, he's not going to win.
So, yeah, well, I know actually what I think I said was he's crazy.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I agree.
Anyway, Chelsea has a last question, and I want to run it down very fast if we can, because I think it's an interesting question.
Okay, so looking to the future, not just to millennials as voters, but as politicians, one day we will have a millennial president. How might you imagine her or him?
I was going to say, let's go with her. Oh, that's a really good question, though. I imagine the campaign will be very different. Well, this feels like such an obvious answer, but more digital, which you already started to see with Trump, bucking the traditional way, not buying really expensive ad campaigns and whatnot. And So maybe more engagement with, one-on-one voters. I mean, something I talk about a lot in journalism is how so much of media is moving from one-to-one conversation versus one-to-many conversation, and that's what social media provides you. And if we're talking about millennials being much more adept at social media, that seems something that a campaign could easily move into, and maybe just feeling more connected on a mass scale rather than shaking hands at a rally. Just speculating.
Anybody else have a one-sentence contribution to this?
I think that they will be solution-oriented and data-driven.
I think they'll be much more friendly to small business.
I'm sorry.
And I think they're a lot more likely to be non-ideological than hyper-ideological.
I have no idea.
That was a great and honest answer. Questions from out here? Yeah. Oh, you need my mic. I have a loud enough voice, it doesn't matter.
So Brian specifically talked about Generation Z and their conservatism. And also, so two-part question. I'm an older millennial, and there's a lot of, today of course, but in general, there's a lot of talk about millennials that leans negatively. But there's also, are there any studies or research that kind of bisects millennials? Because a 23-year-old millennial is different than a 33-year-old millennial, Yeah. And so we get grouped together a lot, but I do remember still having to look in an encyclopedia, So I have that experience where a 23-year-old does not have that experience. So that's the first question. And then the Generation Z, you said they were more conservative, but not on kind of social and cultural issues. So what are they more conservative on?
On economic issues, and then on some social issues, they don't change. Like again, abortion is one of those things that hasn't changed. It just doesn't move back and forth. But on social and civil liberties issues, they're a lot more progressive. On immigration, actually, I think they might be a little bit more conservative. I'm going through memory on my research. But it's typically that libertarian divide of on social and civil liberties issues, a little bit more or a little bit more stable in terms of their older brothers and sisters, and then on economic issues, they're a little bit more conservative. To your other point, the problem with millennial research is it's probably the most researched generation in the history of humankind. And so there is so many different ways. I mean, there's disagreement on when the cutoff is for when you are a millennial or not a millennial, right? So there's, we could have a side conversation about all the different research. The working title of the book is The Next Greatest Generation, which is a play on the greatest generation. So, my research it centers around kind of the positives of the generation and what it is to become, not what it is now. And I think that's where I like to focus, because it's a young generation still too, so it's hard to say this is how you are, this is how you'll always be. But we've seen, cultural revolutions and political revolutions and economic revolutions change generations. And I think that the toughest test for the millennial generation is yet to come. And I think it's important to your point, which is, you and me, I remember encyclopedias when I was very young. A couple years later, they went away. Younger millennials wouldn't have that experience at all. But many of us had the experience of going through this technological disruption during a time of biological change. And also, the most transformative event in our lifetime was not the technological revolution. We have to remember that 9/11 happened in the midst of when we were all growing up. And so that was that cultural moment. And I think that the best is yet to come, because digital revolution and 9/11 completely shape a way a generation thinks. And I think in the next couple of years, we're going to have even bigger issues that will shape how we think.
Anyone else on this? Next question? We got a question? Oh, right there.
Hi. So the last question to the panel is centered around how millennials aren't going to show up during the midterms elections. But one interesting thing that we saw this spring was the 2017 British snap elections, where, similar to the Trump election, there was a shock vote to leave the European Union by mostly older voters in England. And the young people who do vote similarly in terms of turnout in England as they do to America did show up and overwhelmingly voted for the Labour Party, despite polling showing that they were down. So what makes what makes what happened in England different to what's going to happen here in the midterm elections?
Well, I think you make a very important point, because what happened in the polling in the British general election was there was one survey that got it right because it believed people who said they were going to vote. All the other surveys were using past models of turnout, and they were throwing out all these younger people.
They were relying on history?
They were relying on history. So I do think it's an interesting question, and I suspect, by the way, that the answer to it is, it depends on how angry Donald Trump makes a certain group of people by the time the election comes around next November. If it were held today, I think you'd see big turnout. I dissent from all of my friends here on the panel.
It is a good question. Just from a practical perspective, I and a couple other pollsters are starting to expand a model to folks who just haven't had any activity. Now, how that actually looks is still under debate. But take, for example, a typical congressional district turnout model and sample is going to be 400 voters. I'm very likely to add 50 or 100 on top of that, and folks who don't have a really good turnout history. And there's a whole lot of different factors to it, not least of which in California, people are automatically being registered right now. So those people are going to be touched in ways that they've never been touched before because they never raised their hand and said, I want to vote. So they're not just going to start getting sample ballots and things like that they've never seen before, and how they react to that, I don't really know. And so some of that will affect millennials as well. I still don't think there's going to be a meaningful change, but caution is wise. So we're probably going to model a little bit differently just based on that to see if there's any variance. I don't think we'll see.
And I would add, we've had not national elections, but we most certainly had some runoff elections that I mentioned earlier, and they haven't come out overwhelmingly. They haven't tipped the scale, despite some projections that they would. That could change in the 2018 midterm election, but if it changes, I think it changes in coastal communities and urban communities, which are already going to go for Democrats anyway, and so it's not going to have a national effect.
These guys all agree. They all have depressing news. If you're a Democrat about 2018.
By the way, it's not all depressing. I don't think millennials are going to rise up and turn out in huge numbers when they never have before, or that young people are going to change the results of elections all across the country. But I do think swing voters are going to swing against Republicans and Donald Trump, and Democrats are going to have a really good 2018. It's not going to be because millennials turn out. It's going to be because Donald Trump turns off enough swing voters in enough places that seats that weren't competitive and probably shouldn't be competitive become competitive again. And then, it's going to be up to the Democrats if we can take the House and maybe the Senate, although the Senate's pretty tough. It's going to be up to Democrats to actually deliver on some things and hold it.
Yeah, and I think that to make you happy, Bob, that the Trumpistas or the Tea Party voters, if they don't get, I've been telling the Republicans this because they come in and they say, whoa, and I say, I'm just letting you know that if you don't do something on health care, your Tea Partiers and your Trumpistas are turning on you next year, because if you think about how Donald Trump rode a wave to the presidency, was the Tea Party gave him the base. And the Tea Party was a direct response to the Affordable Care Act. And the one thing that Republicans have been promising for the last 6 years is if they got into office, they would repeal the Affordable Care Act. And they have every lever of power to do it, and they're inept. And I bet their own base turns against them for it.
Well, that's interesting, because the Affordable Care Act was never popular until Trump tried to repeal it. And now it's popular. And so there's a dilemma I think that they face. And right now, today, I don't know how it turned out, you have Lamar Alexander negotiating with Patty Murray to come up with a bipartisan bill to repair the Obamacare. What I think they ought to do is, Democrats ought to say it's a new bill and let them call it Trump Care, because who cares what you call it? History will call it. Any other questions? Sure.
Do you see an importance for millennials to in their wherever they work or wherever they spend their time at? Do you find it important for I know for social and like social and economic, like it's, you know, it's good to have like a cohesiveness with like people of different industries, but like, do you think for voting wise, just for voting purposes, that it's important to bind people from different industries, whether it's like the tech industry with heavy manufacturer or the car industry with, you know, another industry? Like, do you think that people in younger sectors, in the millennial sector, need to be looking outside of where they necessarily work at and are getting their immediate relations with people to get a better voter base for next elections coming forth, midterm or presidential elections?
I think that there certainly is groupthink. I think that, like, you know, where you, to your point about geography, where you live, where you work, where you group, you most certainly start to adopt and think in the same attitudes. One thing that I see in millennial populations and then outside of millennial populations as well, that with the advent of social media, you have a situation where people start to associate and share information with people who completely agree with them. So they read the same types of literature, they watch the same TV shows, they read the same newspapers. So if you're conservative, you watch Fox News, you read the Wall Street Journal, etc. If you're liberal, you watch MSNBC, you read the New York Times, etc. And then your social circles, your hive, your echo chamber, your Facebook page reinforces those beliefs so that you don't really have any exchange with people outside of your socioeconomic status, of your work life, of your community. And I think that beyond the impacts on politics, that's really bad for society, because then you start to otherize people and put us in these little bubbles where we don't really understand what the other people think. For me, my Facebook feed is hilariously divided. Half of my friends are super liberal, half of my friends are super conservative. So like my Facebook feed is schizophrenic. And so when friends read it, they'll be like, what the hell? Like, what is wrong with you? My Facebook is all this, or my Facebook is all that. And I think that there's some value in that, because when you have conversations like these, it's really important to understand the perspective of the other side, because you understand why their life situation help shape their viewpoints. And I'm not quite sure how we fix that, but it's most certainly, to your point, yes, please engage other people outside of your immediate circles, because it's only going to make you better and our community stronger.
One last quick question. I think you had your hand up over there, yeah?
Hi, my question is, since there's so much research on millennial voting, is there any consensus of like that there is an answer to it, that there's something that people can implement, or is it just something as people age, maybe the turnout will just slowly get better organically?
There is actually some research that suggests it corrects itself organically. Boomers, for instance, baby boomers turn out at a rate generally of about 69% for elections. Generation X is at 63%, or was in this last election, and it was as low as 39% in 1988. So it does sort of correct itself as folks get more engaged in their careers in society and communities. And among millennials, it was under 50%. So if the trends hold, as those millennials get older, they'll vote in higher percentages, and hopefully at some point they'll begin to mirror the turnout levels of boomers or Generation Xers.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable as people age, they vote at higher rates. I think we've seen that over several generations of turnover. Part of it is that, yes, behaviorally they end up in situations where the habit and routine of voting comes naturally to them. They start getting, as Justin suggested, you know, once you're registered, once you have voted, campaigns or governmental agencies treat you as somebody who votes. You start getting mail, you get knocks on your door, you sort of get pulled into the cycle of political communication. The hardest thing to some degree is often that first step, developing the habit or behavior of voting, and then, you know, getting effectively known, you know, by being on the voter rolls and looking like somebody who votes. So I think that, yes, that they will start voting. The question is, how much can, you know, are events going to have a dramatic external influence on the sort of political activity of young people who wouldn't have had it otherwise? And are there things that campaigns or parties or outside groups or super PACs can do to mobilize them above what they would sort of do of their own volition in the short term?
Okay, first of all, I want to thank the panel. Chelsea. I can be heard, I think. On behalf of the Unruh Institute, the Sociology Department, the Sociology Club, thank you all for coming, and I hope you found it interesting and enlightening, and we'll come back in a year and a month and a half or 2 months, and we'll see if millennials turned out in 2018. Thank you.